Today we're going to work on zippers. I have two zippers here. For class, there's two ways to put in zippers. There's also an invisible zipper, but that's a special zipper. We've got a separating zipper, that's its own thing. But what we're working with is your standard apparel zipper. And you can do a centered application or you can do a lapped application. I'm going to demonstrate both. For your class requirement, you're only required to do the centered application. I don't have instructions to that posted on Blackboard because those instructions are actually in your zipper packet. So you want an all-purpose zipper. I very much prefer the nylon or polyester and not the metal ones, because metal ones, if you have to shorten or adjust them, then you're going to have to use pliers and things to adjust the teeth and get new stops. With the nylon or polyester, you can use your machine for any of that. So you want all purpose. You want to make sure it doesn't say separating or invisible. It may also say universal. So here we go. When you pull out your zipper, and you just need the shortest one, it does come in 7 inches. I believe 7-inch zippers is what is in your kit. These are 9 inches, so I'll be demonstrating how to shorten those. All right, so you'll pull this out of the package, and you'll discard that outer package. Now this part that the zipper is stapled to, these are actually your instructions for how to put on the zipper. And it has both instructions in the packet. Now for the lapped zipper, there's an extra step that I'll show you that actually kind of makes things a little easier, but it's not included in your instructions. All right, so here's our zipper. So these are the teeth. This is a coil zipper. You also may have one that's got the individual separate teeth. But this part's the tape. These are the teeth. This is the zipper pull, right? And then we have a stop down here. This is a metal stop. And we have stops up here for when it comes to the top. Now, when you shorten a zipper, you can purchase new stops that are metal that you just push through and close with a pair of pliers. But I usually just do a fabric stop, and I'll show you how to do that. So there we go. There's our zipper. Now our instructions. So right here on the inside is the lapped application, and on the other side is the centered application. And I'm going to demonstrate the centered application first because, as I stated, this is the one that will be required for your assignment. And these, I have put a copy of these on Blackboard, but like I said, when you buy the zipper, this will be there and available for you. So put our other zipper aside for now. So we're going to we'll need 2 of our squares of fabric. Now because these are 6-inch squares, and this is obviously a much longer zipper, we're going to have to shorten the zipper to fit. And ideally you'd have your tape measure handy, which for some reason I don't have right here. So there's a couple of things we can do if you don't have your tape measure. One of the things is, at least on the Brunina, and I've seen this on others' machines, there's actually a little measuring point right here on the front. We know this is a 6-inch zipper. So if we wanted to end at 6 inches, that is right here. And we're measuring from the top of the tape to the bottom of the zipper, because if this were a garment, you want the tape to, you want that extra space at the top where the tape extends. That generally will go up into the garment, and then this will go into a seam allowance. So that gives you a little bit of room to put that zipper in before you finish the edge. You can also put one in after you finish the edge, in which case you'll just either cut the tape shorter or you can fold that back out of the way. We're going to do that with the tape included in our measurement. Now, one of the things we want to do, so we know we're going to cut the zipper off at 6 inches, which is right here. So I'll just double check. Yes, so that's the length of the fabric, so that's where we want that cut. Now our zipper stop, we don't want our zipper to stop at the bottom, right at the bottom, right there. And we don't want to cut this before we put a stop on it, because if I were to cut this and then try to unzip it, what would happen is my pull would just come right off the end, and then you're all messed up because then you don't have a zipper, functioning zipper anymore. Just want to straighten that pin. So probably about a ½ inch, or maybe more like a ½ inch. Let's split the difference, 3/8. We want to put a stop right here so that the zipper will stop going before it gets to the end of the fabric. And normally we'd be putting this into a seam that already exists, so the seam would continue on past the zipper. But here it's just going to end where the zipper ends. So what we're going to do is we're going to do what's called a fabric tack or back tack. What you'll need to do is you'll need to put your stitch width on the widest stitch length, which on the Bernina is 5. And we're going to put our stitch length at 0. So we don't want the machine to travel anywhere. We don't want the stitch to travel anywhere. It's going to stay in place, but it's going to go back and forth across here, creating a little fabric barrier, a little thread barrier rather. Did I say fabric tack? I meant thread tack. So we want to put however we've marked our initial, where we're going to put the tack. I like to start my needle down. I'll remove that pin. And this is especially good when you have nylon or polyester zippers, because if we had a metal zipper here, the chances of us hitting the metal teeth and breaking the needle would, of course, be greater. So what we would have done is we definitely would have put that metal tack in instead of the fabric. So I'll start slow to make sure that I'm clearing the zipper, and I am. So then you're just going to stitch in place. For quite a few passes. I'll bring this out and cut that off. I keep forgetting that the thread cutter on here is very bad. All right, so now what we've done is we've just put this thread tack right here at the bottom of the zipper. So, and clip, we aren't going to press yet. Now if you wanted to, you could press this zipper where this little kink is, but since we're cutting that off, it's not important anyway. But now my zipper will stop at that thread tack. And eventually that will wear out. So if it's a long running thing, or something you want going to wear long term, then that metal stop is a good option. But if you don't have those, you can always do a thread one. So this is where I want to cut it. Now, if you see this little edge here, this is cut with a pinking shear. So that helps to keep it from raveling or unraveling. We're just going to use a regular shear for this. Right? And our shears have that bent angle so that when we're cutting fabric, it can lay flat on the table as opposed to your regular scissors. Okay, so now we've shortened our zipper. So now our zipper is going to fit our fabric. So now that we've gotten our zipper prepared, now we're ready to actually do the seam. So what we want to do first is we're actually going to baste in our seam. So you match up your edges nice and straight. And pin. Now this, because we are going to be starting and stopping, this basted seam will have a back tack, but just literally like one stitch. Now before we start stitching, we need to make sure we get our controls proper. So our width goes back to 0. So basically we're just switching, and then we're going to our longest stitch length for back stitching. For some reason my needle's to the side. Okay. All right, so I like to start with my needle down, presser foot down. You must always have the presser foot down. And we're just literally going to do one stitch and back stitch. And then it's a regular 5/8 seam. We're just basting it using our longest stitch length because we will be pulling the seam out. Well, my stitch did not take the whole way, so I'll be sewing that seam again, which is something that will sometimes happen. Not quite sure why it happened here. So we're going to try it again. I do recommend that you pin. But since it's a short seam and it's a straight seam, then you might be able to get away with not pinning. But when you're just starting out, it's better to pin pretty much every time. All right, remember I turned my hand wheel toward me to make sure that the looper is at the top before I pull my fabric away. And this time I have a seam. I have stitching on both sides. All right, so now we've basted in our seam. We're going to open the fabric and press our seam open. All right, seam, basted in, pressed open. Now we're going to take our zipper, we're going to open it up, and we're going to lay it face down on the seam allowance. So the front of the zipper is the side with the pull. This is the back side of the slide. Well, I guess that's really the slide, and this little flappy part's the pull. So the pull is going to go against the fabric. Now we're going to work on the single side of the seam allowance, right? So I'm going to let my fabric fall away, and I'm just going to stitch this initially to that seam allowance. You want to line the teeth up with the stitching. And the edge of the zipper up with the edge of the fabric, and the teeth go along your stitching. All right, we've done our seam. Now we're sewing our zipper. So we actually need to change the foot on the machine. You need to have your zipper foot for this step. Now the Bernina has two different zipper feet. And I did not pull out the zipper foot. That is a blind hem foot. So the zipper foot looks like, so this is our snap-on zipper foot, okay? So this little bar snaps into the foot under here. So this has so your zipper foot, your presser foot in general is this part here. This upper part is the shank. And let me turn the light off actually because it's putting too much glare. So the shank on a snap if you have snap-in zipper feet, then the shank remains on the machine and you just move the feet. So for this one, there's a button back here that you push, and then that foot just drops right off. So then you'll take your zipper foot and you'll hold it in place so that the foot lines up with it, and you'll just put the presser foot down on it onto the little bar. Okay? And the zipper foot is designed in a way that this foot can slide from one side to the other to avoid the teeth on the zipper, right? So we've got a little notch where the needle goes, and the foot is holding down on the one of the zipper tape, but it's avoiding the teeth. We also have this option. This is another zipper foot for the Bernina. So this is the shank and the foot all in one. And oftentimes you'll have to unscrew these on different machines. On the Bernina, there's a little lever that you pull, and you just pull the shank down and you replace it this way. Okay? Now, this one, the foot does not move, so you have to move your needle from one side to the other to avoid hitting the foot. So that's kind of the difference. The snap-on foot will slide side to side for you, and the shank zipper foot, you have to move your needle. Okay? I prefer the snap-on zipper foot so I don't have to move my needle, but sometimes the bar will fall out, so that's why we have both available in the event that one of them doesn't work. All right, so that is our zipper foot. Now we have our zipper foot on, and we're going to stitch the zipper tape to just that one flap of the seam allowance. And we need the zipper foot to be on the tape side of the zipper. So for here, it needs to be pushed over toward the right. And we're going to put the zipper teeth right next to that narrow edge of the zipper foot. Now we're basting this part in as well. And if you keep the teeth right next to that edge of the foot, then you're going to have this nice and close, and you're going to get a better result with getting the zipper in. Now when we get down here to the pull, it doesn't want to sit close to the foot and wants to kind of bump out. So what I like to do is put my needle down in the fabric, lift my foot, and see if I can slide the zipper past the presser foot. So that I can have a clean line down here at the bottom. All right, again, loop her up before we pull away. We clip. So now we've stitched, and it bumped away a little bit. Oh, we cut a little wrinkle. Well, that's not acceptable to me, so I'm going to fix it. All right, because I didn't want that seam wrinkled in there because we want it to fit in there smoothly, I'm just going to pull the stitching out from the point where I don't like it down. And I'll go ahead and pull my zipper pull out of the way. Well, I can't really pull it out of the way yet because I can't see the teeth on there, can I? All right, let's make sure my teeth are lined up. I'll put a pin in parallel instead. All right, now I'm going to pull that guy out of the way. And now I'm just going to start stitching where I pulled that off. So if you have to pull part of a seam out, you can go back and pick up right where you left off. You're just going to need to do a little back stitch before you stop and start again. All right, so that's better. Now I have a straight line. This sewing machine needs a little TLC, but that's going to hold it in place. All right, so now we're going to close the zipper, and we're going to flip over, and we've sewn this one to this side. So now we're going to sew the other half of the tape to the other side. Now all we're doing Like I said, we've closed the zipper, and that's going to cause it to just lay on the seam. So now we just want to stitch it to that seam allowance. It's the exact same process. We're just going from the bottom up instead of the top up, down. Put it under the foot. You want to make it sure it's nice in there, nice and flat. Tiny back stitch. And again, we're keeping the teeth right next to that narrow part of the foot. When we get up here to the top with the pole, we can't really unzip that now. So we just want to be extra kind of careful about stitching there, because we still want it to be nice and flat. But I have to lift that foot up to get the pole under it a little bit, because we don't want our needle to hit that pole, because the pole is metal and it can break our needle. Okay, so now we have our zipper tape stitched just to the seam allowance. So it's basically just holding it in place for us. I'm going to trim my threads so I can keep my project a little neat. Okay, so now we've basted it onto the seam allowance, and what we're going to do now is we're actually going to stitch from the, so this would be the outside of the garment because that's where the seam is. So we're actually going to do our connecting stitching with the part that's actually sewing it to the garment on the outside, because whenever possible you want the top stitch to be the stitch that's being seen. And we know that this is, so basically we're going to stitch a 1/4 inch away from the seam allowance on either side. Now if you, this is a measurement that I'm fairly familiar with because I sew so much. So I can kind of eyeball it, but if you want to, you can take your seam allowance or you can take a ruler. And then you can take a fabric marking pen and you can actually measure a 1/4 inch away from your seam allowance. Do this on either side. And you can create your own little stitching line. Another option that I have seen that seems to work fairly well, if you get 1/2 inch wide Scotch tape, you can actually put that, center that over the seam, and then you just stitch along the edge of that Scotch tape, right? So I've kind of made little dots I can connect. You can just draw those as a line if you wanted to be a little more precise to make sure you get that a 1/4 inch away. And the reason why that's important is because this is what's going to be, this stitching will be seen on the outside of the garment. You will see that line. So if that line isn't nice and neat and clean, then it's going to affect what your garment looks like. This is a time, now that I'm going to do construction stitching, so I need to switch my, from basting to construction, so I'll go from 5 to 2.5. I want to start at the top and give a real back stitch. Now again, that metal pole is under there. I need to be conscious and conscientious of that placement and make sure that I'm accommodating that so I don't hit my needle doesn't land on it. All right, so I'm starting at the top. Now, one thing that you could do is we want our stitching to end right about where our fabric tack is, so you can actually put a pin there to mark that so you'll know where to stop and turn. So we'll come down to the end. And like I said, if this was going on a real garment, there would be a seam that continued on down here, but there isn't. So we're just going to the end of the fabric. Now we get, well, almost the end of the fabric, wherever your tack is. So if our tape is 6 inches long, you want to put that tack anywhere from half inch to an inch up from where it's cut. I did mine actually a little too close to the bottom. All right, so I'm going to come straight down. When I get to the end, when it's time to turn, I'm going to put my needle down. I'm going to lift my foot up. I'm going to turn it 90 degrees. This is called pivoting. And then I'm going to stitch straight across. And since these are polyester or nylon teeth, my needle will generally go through that, which it would not with a metal zipper. So if you had a metal zipper here, you'd have to be very careful not to drop your needle down onto those metal teeth. You'd kind of coax it through by using your hand wheel. So when I'm about a half inch or quarter inch past my seam allowance, I'm going to put my needle in, lift my foot, and pivot again, and come back up the other side. So if your zipper is sewn on properly, then the stitching lines here are going to be equidistant from the center of that seam, that basted seam. Again, be careful of your foot, the zipper pull at the top. And I'm switching to the hand wheel so I can have a little more control until I get past it. I get to the end and I'll backstitch. All right, looper at the top, pull my thread away. Like I said, it gets tricky around that pull. So ideally it should look something like this. Like I said, I went a little too far down here, so I couldn't get that clean turn because my tack is right there. So what I'm going to be looking for is that you've got two straight stitches on either side of your seam, of the center seam, and they should be pretty much equidistant from each other. Now, our zipper is in, but we can't access it because the seam is closed. So the next step is to take your seam ripper or small snips and pull that seam allowance, that fabric, that seam, basted seam out. One of the things it tells you to do in the zipper instructions that I didn't do is it tells you on this initial seam that you basted in, it recommends that every few inches you clip that. And the reason why is it makes this step a little easier because then you just kind of pull out a couple inches at a time. But since this is overall so short, I just pull the whole thing. All right, so now we've opened up that zipper and it can actually function. So that's your centered application zipper. There we go. And that's your required zipper. And next we'll do the lapped zipper. A lot of similar processes. The zipper is just basically shifted over to one side so that we don't have these two flaps here. We've just got one that covers the whole zipper. All right. So now we need our other zipper. This one is also a 9-inch zipper, and as you see, I have a whole nother set of instructions. Oh, I need the zipper. I don't need the instructions. All right, get rid of this staple. All right, once again, I want to shorten this to fit my 6-inch fabric. I know I got my zipper tag too far down last time, so I'm going to come here, and that's 5 inches. That's a little farther away than I want, so I'll eyeball about 1/2 inch. Or you use your tape measure to measure that exactly, so on and so forth. All right, doing a thread tack, length 0, width 5. Now I cannot do a fabric tack with my zipper foot in because it's either going to wrap itself around that zipper, around that foot, or it's going to hit the metal and break. So I need to go back to my regular foot. And if you're using a machine at home, there will be a zipper foot. How it goes on and what it looks like may be a little bit different. But it's going to either be one that will slide out of the way. It may not be a snap-on one, but it's going to be one where you either slide the foot side to side or it's stationary and you have to move your needle. All right. Put my needle in right where I've set my thread tack to be. And just go back and forth a bunch. Oops. I moved that. I'll have to measure that again. Okay, so I've got my tack in. My new stopper. Now I'm going to cut that. All right, so there's my adjusted zipper to fit my 6-inch piece of fabric. Now I'm going back to zipper, so I'm going to switch my foot back to the zipper foot. Now my thread is starting to pull a little strangely. So in order to try to combat that, I'm going to rethread my machine. You saw that we had a little issue. Yeah. Earlier, so rethreading your machine 9 times out of 10 is going to fix whatever's going on. So put my bobbin in, pull it through the case properly, make sure it's clockwise. All right, now I'll rethread the top. Spindle, first thread guide down into the tension, second guide up, back and over through the looper, final thread guide at the top, trim for a clean edge. I'm going to turn my light back on so I can see my needle. Front to back. Ah, it didn't go in. Front to back. All right, now I need to pick, oh, hello. See, that's what happened. So I forgot to take it off zigzag. And when I went to go down, my needle went straight into the metal of that foot. So fortunately, I was going slow and paying attention. So now I need to make sure that goes back to 0 so that I can do my revolution to pull my bobbin thread up. All right, so now she's ready to go. I've back on 0 here. And we're going to start with basting again. So I'm going to go back all the way down to 5. I've got my 2 pieces of fabric. Match up my edges. It's nice to have a trash can right next to your sewing machine. For some reason, I moved mine, so I'm just piling thread up on the table for now, which doesn't help keep things neat and tidy. So I advise you to have a trash can close to your sewing machine. All right, so I'm going to switch my foot back. because I'm basting in my seam, 5/8, needle in, foot down, single stitch back stitch, and get to the end. Again, quick little back stitch, looper at the top, pull the thread away. All right, back to our zipper foot. Now our lapped zipper is going to start, well, let me press my seam open. There we go. All right, the lapped zipper is going to start the same way that the centered zipper started. We're going to open it up. We're going to put the face down on our seam allowance. We're going to work on start with the single seam allowance. Pin the tape to the seam allowance. It's by itself with the teeth right next to the seam. Now, if you want the lap that's covering the zipper to be deeper and hide it more, then you would actually start with your teeth further away from that center seam. But you would have to create a deeper seam allowance to do that. But that would be the only difference is starting farther away from that seam. That's how you're going to get that zipper kind of lap. And the purpose of a lapped zipper is to kind of hide the teeth. Centered application, the teeth are relatively exposed. If you treat a centered application zipper similar to an invisible zipper, then the teeth are going to be exposed even more. But an invisible zipper, again, is a whole different thing. It's meant to be hidden inside the seam so that when it's closed, you can't tell there's a zipper there, except for the pull at the top. All right, so we started just the same. The side of the tape on our single seam allowance edge, teeth aligned with the seam. Slide my zipper foot over. Oh no, it has to be over here. I was wrong. So you want that part of the foot to be on the tape. So the the thinner part of the foot rides along the teeth. I need to restore them. Well, I'm still basting. All right, little back stitch. Just keep those teeth nice and close to that foot. All right, I'm fairly close to the pull. I want to get the pull out of the way. See if I can get it past. There we go. All right, and you just have to kind of, I should have left my pin in before I did that so I'd know that we were still lined up. All right, get down to the end. Little back stitch. Okay, now here's where we start to break away in our steps from the centered application. So what we're going to do now, instead of, and it doesn't matter if the zipper is open or not at this point. So what we would do now for the centered application, we would stitch this to the other seam allowance. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to fold this back so that that edge between, so this is where we just sewed it, and that's the original seam. We want to expose that area in between because we're going to stitch in between that stitching line and this stitching line. So we're going to stitch right in there, okay? And you don't have to pin it necessarily, but I think it helps to lay a little flatter if you do. It'll just help you keep that nice and flat and pulled away. And we do want to put some tension on it as we pull it away from the teeth on the zipper. Now when we go back into stitch, we want to stitch very close to that original seam, but we don't want to go over it. Okay, so we're just stitching in this little ditch here. It does help to open it just to get our pull out of the way. Now this one is going to go back to construction from here on out. So we basted the seam closed, we basted the first side of the tape in, and now we're on construction stitching. All right, once again, we're getting down to the end. Let's try to get our pull out of the way. If you can get it under the foot, yes. Come down past your thread tack, back stitch. All right. So now if we look, you can see that original seam and you see the new stitching. So we didn't cross over, but I was able to get that really close. And the closer you can get that, usually the deeper the lap is going to be. But if I were to catch that or sew on it, then I wouldn't be able to open the zipper up. All right, so that's our goal, to get close to that original seam without going over it. So now the next step is we're kind of going back to the centered application, but we're going to be off center. So now I'm going to lay this down flat, and I want to lay it so I want to make sure that I am not like bunching the seam allowance up in here. I want to make sure this is laying nice and flat and I can't feel anything kind of folded up inside. And from here, you could pin that down and go from there, but I find that when you pin it, then you get a little bit of shifting. So what I actually like to do is to take a needle and thread and stitch that down. And that's kind of an extra step to do. But I do think that in the long run, it gives you a better finish on your zipper so that it looks cleaner and neater. And it's good to use a contrasting thread for this because you're going to make sure that you pull that out. Again, I am using contrasting thread for all these projects so you can see the stitching. But in reality, you really would be using thread that matched your fabric as closely as possible. And that's a thing you'll have to think about for your vest. Now I just need a single strand for this. That was the right side. So I'm not going to make my tails even. I'm just going to make sure that one side goes nicely a very far amount through the needle. And then I'm just going to come down to that other side and tie my knot. All right, so now I'm going to take my zipper, and from this side, I'm going to stitch this zipper. I'm just going to baste it in place by hand. So what that's going to do, accomplish two things. That's going to hold this in place like pinning would, and it doesn't really take much longer than pinning, but it's also going to give me a nice straight stitching line to follow on the other side. I always do this when I'm doing a lap to zipper because it just, that way you don't end up getting off, you don't end up stitching over the teeth. And again, this could be an instance where you might draw your line, but I think it's going to be just as fast to do this. And we are stitching through all the layers, and it's just a long in and out stitch because we're just creating a little stitching guide on the other side. This way you make sure you're nice and equidistant from the teeth, which gives you an automatic line to follow. Now I want to go past my thread tack, but just barely. And make sure you stitch it so it shows on the other side. All right? And now I'm just going to tie another knot just to hold this in place. Now this is going to come out when we're done with the seam, so we don't need to worry about making it particularly secure. We just want to have it, it's just holding, it's a placeholder. Hello. Well, I dropped that. I'll pick it up later. Okay. All right, so now we've basted this in place, and again, it doesn't take much longer than pinning, and it holds it like pinning would, but at the same time, we're getting ourselves a nice clean stitching line. So this time I do want to slide my foot over because now my teeth are over. No, I don't want to. Why do I keep moving that? So my teeth are over here and I'm stitching here. So, and we know we want the short side of the foot on the tape side. Now I'm just going to stitch right along this thread guide. Again, be very conscientious and careful as you go past the pull. I do recommend switching to the hand for this. If you notice, what I do sometimes is I'll lift the foot up to kind of, because it's kind of bulky, that helps to advance the pull underneath the foot. And of all the things, the thing I'm going to be the most forgiving of is if you get a little jump around the pole, because sometimes that's just kind of unavoidable. So again, when it's time to turn the corner, needle down, foot up, turn, foot back down. That's pivoting. And now for on the centered application, we went across the seam. We're going to stop at the seam line here. And then I'm going to back tack. And I'm actually just going to go the length of the stitching so I've got a nice secure stop. All right, so as you see, we're stitched right on that stitching line. Again, that pull tends to cause a little problems, so if you get a little wiggle there, that's going to, now you do want, I want to see you made an effort to get close, but if there's a little wiggle up there, that's understandable. So you see I sewed pretty much right on top of that guideline. I'm going to take my seam ripper. So I don't know if we've talked about the seam ripper. This little thing is your best friend and your most hated enemy is what I like to call it. It's your best friend because it helps you to undo mistakes, but it's your worst enemy because whenever you see it, you know you've made a mistake. Seam ripper. Okay, so I'm going to use this, and this is why I use contrasting thread to go in and pull out that little basting guy. All right. Okay. So now that's all gone. Clip my regular threads. All right, so now we're back to the same place we were with the centered application. We can't actually, the zipper is in securely and properly, but we can't access it because our seam is closed. So now you can use little snips, or you can use your seam ripper. And down in the crook of that seam ripper, that's actually a blade in there, so you can actually cut the threads. But you just basically use that to get in between and pull the little threads out. I just tend to do that till I can get a good grip on it, and then I just kind of pull it, as you see. And again, if you did what is recommended on the instructions and clipped every 2 inches or so, that would go a little faster. All right, so now you see my zippers hidden. So that first stitching gets that one side nice and secure to the garment, and then we've got this little flap that covers the zipper. That's our lap in our lapped zipper. Okay, and then remember we sewed the hooks and eyes for closures. A hook and eye would often be at the top of this, just to help secure it and to give it tension when you're opening it and closing it. And there's our lapped zipper. So those are the 2 zipper applications. Again, and see, the lapped zipper is just much cleaner, in my opinion. Of course, if the zipper matches and you want it to be decorative, that's a whole nother thing. But if you're trying to disguise it, because sometimes, like for a quick change, we might have a zipper here and might have a nice deep lap, and we'd put buttons on top of that. So it looks like it's a button closure, but you don't have to do all those buttons. You can just unzip it really quickly, so on and so forth. All right, so there's our zippers. Centered is required, lapped extra credit. Thank you very much.